Hello and welcome everybody. Today we'll be going over Laravel in depth to prepare ourselves for the certification exam. And in this video, we'll be discussing migrations. Defining migrations. Migrations are used in Laravel to set up and modify the database. You can think of migrations as a type of version control for your project's database. This way, if you're working in a team and you change your database in some way, you won't have to ask your colleagues to manually change theirs, but rather just run the migrations again and the changes will all be the same. Within each new Laravel project, you'll notice that you'll start out with a few migrations. These are stored in the database migrations folder. If you're going to have users and passwords and set up cron jobs, then definitely leave them in there. Otherwise, of course, you can delete them. Looking at the migration itself, we can see that the class extends the base migration class. It then contains two separate methods, the up and down methods. The up method is used to create the table, or in certain circumstances, to add more columns or otherwise modify or delete the table. And the down method simply reverses these actions. We can see here in the create users table migrations that the up method is using the schema facade to create the users table. Taking a look at the schema facade, we can learn a few things from here. First, in the doc block at the top, we can see the range of methods that we have available to us. We can create, drop, and rename our tables through these methods. We can also disable and enable foreign key constraints, and the table method is used to modify a specific table that already exists. We can see all these methods and how they are executed in Illuminate Database Schema Builder. Then, back in the schema facade, we can see how we are connecting to our database through the connection method. We can see that it is using the service container to connect to the database. Let's go into a web router and dump this into the browser to see what's going on. So if we dump the connection method into the browser, we can see that we're connecting using PHP data objects, also known as PDO, to connect to our MySQL database. Then within config, we can see our database connection information. Note that all this is set up within config/database.php file, which can be set to something other than MySQL. Going back to our migration, let's inspect our up method. As we discussed, it's using the create method on the schema facade to create the users table. It passes an anonymous function as a callback using the blueprint table. Then it uses table to create the columns ID, name, email verified at, password, and remember token. It also creates the timestamps. In the blueprint schema, we can see that the timestamps method creates the created at and updated at columns. In fact, in here we can see all the methods that are available to us to create and modify our database columns. If we go to the ID method, we can see how the ID column was created. In fact, this method accepts one argument, which is the name of the column. So if we wanted to, we could pass a string into the ID method to name this something other than ID. Going to the string method, we can see the same thing here. The first parameter is the name of the column, and the second parameter, which is optional, is the length in characters. Then the last thing to examine in the create users table migration is the down method. We can see here that running this method will drop the users table if it exists, essentially undoing everything that we did in the up method. Connecting to the database. Now that we have an idea of how the migrations work, let's connect to our database and try this out. In order to do this, we'll have to edit our settings within the .env file. Once there, we'll edit these settings, the DB connection, DB host, DB port, database username, and password. So we're connecting via MySQL on localhost. We can leave DB connection, DB host, and DB port as they are. Note that once you connect to a live database, then you'll have to change all of these settings to match the database on your server. Then for the DB username and password, these will be for your local host. I am assuming that you have MySQL already set up, so you'll be using those credentials here. Then once you have connected, we'll need to create a new database. We'll be connecting via MySQL on localhost. You can access the data through the terminal, but I find that there are several applications that make this easier. I personally use SQL Pro, but there are a lot of programs out there such as Tables Plus. I'll leave these links in the description below. Now that you have connected to localhost on SQL Pro, go ahead and add the database. Our database is simply called blog, and I'll add that here. Now that we have our credentials set up in our .env file, as well as the database created in SQL Pro, we can go ahead and run our migrations. Running migrations. To run our migrations, we can use the artisan command php artisan migrate. But before we do that, let's attach the help flag and see what options we have. Here, we can see that we have quite a few options that we can use with this command. I just want to point out one or two of them that I use often. The first is the path flag, and here you can specify which migration you want to run. So imagine that in the middle of your project, you want to add another table, but don't want to affect the other tables and the other information that is already there. You'll use the path flag to then indicate which migration you would like to run. Then we also have the seed flag, which allows you to seed the database with dummy data. Now let's run the migration command. Going back to SQL Pro, if we refresh the database, we can see that all of our migrations have run. We have the users, passwords, and failed jobs tables, as well as a migrations table to keep track of all of our migrations. Undoing migrations. Imagine that we wanted to undo a migration. Essentially here we would be running the down method within each of the migrations in our latest batch of migrations. In other words, it will undo the last migration that you ran. All we would need to do is run php artisan migrate rollback. However, if we want to undo all of our migrations, in other words, all of the batches of our migrations, we would run php artisan migrate reset. If you're wondering what these batches are, then just go to the migrations table and you'll see them in the batch column. Since we only have one batch currently, the rollback and reset functions will essentially do the same thing. But normally in a project, you'll have several different batches and you'll want to choose them correctly. Then if you would like to roll back a specific step of migrations, you can use the step flag in order to get that particular batch. So in this case, you would have a step flag. And well, since we only have one batch, I'll use step equals 1. You can also refresh your migrations, which will essentially roll back and then run the migrations again. This is a good way to just start over with your databases clean. You can do this by running php artisan migrate refresh. Then if you have any database seeds that you would like to run, you can add the seed flag here. I haven't created any seeders yet, so no new data will appear in the database. But I will be talking about this topic in the next video. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that one. But if we have these seeders all set up, then the seed data would appear in the database after we run the migration. And finally, we have another option here, which is only slightly different from refresh, which is fresh. It is almost the same thing. However, instead of rolling back all of your migrations, it simply drops all the tables and then executes the migrate command. You may not notice the difference straight away, but you can tell within the migrations table that the IDs will start back at 1 if you run fresh instead of refresh, creating a new table. To create your own migration, you can use the make migration artisan command. Let's add the help flag and take a look at the command in the terminal. Here we can see that we need at least a name. The name will be used to create the name of the file. So following the pattern, we can see that we should write create underscore, then the name of the table, another underscore, and the word table. Let's give this a shot. php artisan make migration create posts table. We can see here that the create posts table migration has been created. Note that by following this pattern with create, then the name of the table, and then the word table, the framework will set up the schema and the table name for you, as well as a few standard columns. However, imagine that we named it something else, such as make comments table. In this migration, you can see that the up method, we have no starter code to work off of. There are 61 different column types in Laravel Schema Builder. You can check them all out in the documentation, and I have left a link in the description below. There are also 16 different column modifiers that we can use. Let's go over a quick example to see how they work. So after creating the post table migration, let's go into the migration and see what we have so far. Now within the create method, we can see that yes, I want to keep the ID column as well as the created at and updated at columns. Let's add a few more in there as well. To add a string, we'll simply use the string method. Then as we can see in the schemas blueprint, which is found in Illuminate Database Schema Blueprint, the string method accepts 2 parameters, the column name and the limit. Maybe I'll call it title, and I'll set the limit to 255 characters. Then let's add a boolean. Looking at the blueprint, we can see that it only accepts 1 parameter, which is the column name. Okay, let's call this publish. Then let's use a modifier to set the default value to false. So we'll say default, false will be 0 in this case. Then imagine we want to set a column's possible value. So on the front end, this would look like a select box. We can do this with the set method. Looking at the blueprint, we must pass in 2 parameters. The first is the name of the column, and the second is an array of the allowed values. So let's set type of blog post, and maybe we'll say travel and finance. Then let's use a modifier to allow a null value in this column. Then for the last example, let's add an integer. Let's make sure that it's positive and it does not auto increment. Looking at the blueprint, we can see that the parameters are the name of the column and if the integer auto increments and if it is unsigned. So in our case, maybe we'll put order, false, and true. Then let's go ahead and migrate our database. We can see that the post table has been migrated, and if we come back and refresh the database, we can see that we have the post table with all of our information set up. Editing an existing table. To be honest, how you edit an existing table depends on your situation. If you are still in development and you don't have any important data in your database yet, it makes more sense to simply adjust your migrations as necessary and just refresh your migrations. This way everything stays clean. Note, however, that this removes all of your data. Now, if you're editing an existing table that's running live on a server with actual data that you do not want to remove, then I would suggest adding another migration specifically for these adjustments. To update an existing table, we will need to add another migration. Like before, we will run PHP artisan make migration. However, this time, in order to get the pre-made stub built for editing tables, we should name the migration something that ends with to, then underscore, then the table's name, and then table. For example, updates to posts table. This will set up our up method nicely with the schema method already set to table, which is how we edit the table, as well as the table's name. A prerequisite to modifying columns is the Doctrine DBAL package. You just run composer require Doctrine/DBAL. Now, once that has been installed, we have one last thing to do, and we'll go to the config database. In here, to be honest, you don't have to do it, but if you are planning on editing any of the timestamps, then you should do this. But maybe it's a good practice to do it anyway, just in case you want to edit timestamps in the future. So what you'll do is import here at the top the database DBAL timestamp type. Then at the bottom, before the final closing bracket, add the following snippet. I personally like to add a comment here in case someone is reading this in the future and has no idea why the snippet of code is here. So I just put in a comment here saying that it is a requisite for modifying columns with timestamps. And let's go back to the update to posts table migration. And if we wanted to add a new column, we would do that the same way as we did before. But if we wanted to change any column, then we would need to add the changes that we would like to see along with the change method chained onto it. So for example, in our create post table, we have the title with 255 characters limit. In here, imagine if we want to bring this down to 200, say, then we would just have to attach the chain method onto this, and it will change the existing title column to have a character limit of 200. Then I wanted to note that, for instance, if we wanted to change the type column to include another type of post, we actually cannot do that because we cannot modify the set column type because that change is not supported. To give you an idea, only the following column types can be modified. So big integer, binary, etc., etc. All of these can be modified, but the others cannot. Then imagine if we want to rename a column. So before we had this order column, which is an integer, we just need to use the rename column method. And let's say we want to rename it from order to placement. So we would have here order, whatever we go from, and then whatever we want to change to. Finally, we can also delete columns using the drop column method. This method accepts either a string to drop single columns or an array to drop multiple columns. So if we wanted to just drop the publish column, we would just leave in that string publish. Otherwise, we can add an array here, and this would drop both of these columns. Dropping or renaming a table. In order to drop a table, you can always roll back the migration that created the table. Sometimes, however, you just want to do this in another migration. That's fine. All you need to do is create a new migration. You can name it more or less as you like, as there is no stub for either dropping or renaming tables. However, remember that the migration name should always be in snake case. To do this, let's run PHP artisan make migration drop posts table. You can see here that we get the standard migration stub. In the up method, we'll need to use the schema facade, and then we have two methods that we can use here. We can simply use the drop method, or in case we're not sure if the table exists, then you should use the drop if it exists method, but otherwise they do the same thing. Now, we are assuming that the project is in production, and so for our migration, we'll want to add the path flag. And in order to get the path, all I do here is copy the relative path, and you can paste that in there. So this is how you would form the path. And you can see here that it has dropped the post table. Indices. In MySQL, we often create indices to ensure uniqueness and to help speed up data retrieval. When searching for data, MySQL will first see if an index exists, and if so, we'll look only at those rows instead of looking at the whole table. In Laravel's migrations, we can create an index in several ways. First, we can simply attach the unique method. You can also pass an index after a column has already been created. So here, if we're creating the name column, then afterward, we can state that it is unique. You can also create a composite index by passing an array of columns within the unique method. However, if you just pass a second string to the unique method, this sets the name for the index. For a primary key, we'll use the primary method. Note that unlike unique keys, there can only be one primary key and the value cannot be null. It is also possible to have a composite primary key as it acts as one sole key. For composite primary keys, we use the primary method again, yet we pass an array of columns. So in this case, we'll have maybe ID and post ID as well to create the primary key. To create an index, we use the index method. Note that this must also be unique, but it is mostly used for query performance. Then, to create a spatial index, we use the spatial index method. Note that a spatial index is used for indexing geographic data or shapes. So here, maybe we would use it for location. You can also rename an index. In this example, we'll rename the index from social insurance number to SIN. Finally, dropping these indices is just as easy. Let's go ahead and take a look at an example here. Here you can see that I have the primary key as email. I set the business ID as unique, the province as an index, and set location as a spatial index. Now let's go ahead and migrate these changes. And when we turn to SQL Pro, here we can see that our migrations have been run and our columns are here at the top. Here at the bottom, we can see the list of our indices. Please take note of the key names column here, as we'll be using these later on. To remove these indices, there are 4 methods: the drop primary, drop unique, drop index, and drop spatial index. Note here that we are not passing in the column name, but rather the index name, which is what we have here at the bottom. Alternatively, you could use a query to find this information. So here what I'm doing is selecting each table, finding the index name from the information schema, and getting the statistics where the table schema is blocked, so where my database is called block. And so you can see here under the business table, I have these 4 index names. Now, once we run this migration again, now that we have run the migration again, we can see the indices have been removed. Foreign keys. We use foreign keys to link 2 tables together, usually creating one column that contains the ID of the values of another column in another table. Using a foreign key constraint will prevent you from deleting a row in one table that was used as a foreign key in another, which would leave the reference empty. I have a quick outline here of how this actually works. So for example, if we have 3 tables, footballers, squads, and leagues, then we would use foreign keys to link the 3 tables. So the squad ID and league ID in the footballers table would be foreign keys. The same thing goes for the league ID within the squads table. In Laravel, you can create a foreign key constraint by using the foreign, references, and on methods. For example, here we have the unsigned big integers, both squad ID and league ID, and in order to create the foreign keys, we add foreign and then the name of the column. It references what is the original column name on the squads table, and then on delete will just cascade. Note that this can be shortened to foreign ID and then the name of the column as well as constraint. However, the latter syntax assumes that you follow a few conventions. First, that the column passed in the foreign ID method is an unsigned big integer, and second, that the name of the foreign table is the singular form of the noun followed by underscore ID. If that sounds a bit too complicated, just use the foreign, references, and on methods. That, for me at least, reads more easily and causes fewer headaches. Then you'll want to add a few modifiers on cascade, which means that if a parent record is deleted, then any child records are also deleted. And on update, which means that if the parent primary key is changed, then the child value will also change. To drop a foreign key, you can use the drop foreign method. Note that the foreign key constraints use the same naming method as the indices. For example, it is usually the table name followed by the column name and then underscore foreign. So we can see here that we're using footballers underscore squad ID underscore foreign. And this is the same thing that we have here within SQL Pro. You can see the key name is footballers, squad ID, foreign. If you would like to just use the column name, you can do this as well. However, the syntax is slightly different. Instead of passing the foreign constraint name, you can simply pass the column name, but you will need to do this within an array. So we have here is drop foreign, and then we have the squad ID here, which is the name of the column as opposed to the name of the index. Updates for Laravel 8. Starting in Laravel 8, we can now squash our migrations. This will combine all of your migration files into one single SQL file. To do this, you can run the following artisan command: php artisan schema dump. When we do this, we can see that we get a mysql-schema.dump file within the newly created schema folder inside of the database directory. Now, instead of running the migrations individually, Laravel will execute this SQL file first, as well as any migrations that have been created after it. Then, if we want to delete the old migration files, we can simply add the prune flag. And as you can see here, the migrations folder was deleted, and all we're left with is the schema folder. Any new migrations will be added to a newly created migrations folder. So this is Laravel's migrations in a nutshell. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to write in the comments section below. And if you're planning on taking the certification exam, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.